Sorry. Okay.
Another thing that I was saying is that like a lot of people go by the thing like everything happens for a reason. But if we're in a simulation, that changes things. Like everything's planned out by someone.
Yeah, so let's explore that a little bit. How does that change things? Um,
Yeah, I guess I'll add, like, I mean, we all know that we exist, whether we're in a simulation or not, because I guess we can, like, essentially doubt our existence, which proves our existence. But, I mean, if we were really in a simulation, even though we exist, like, who's really controlling us? Who's creating the situations that we're in? Like, say, you break your leg on tripping on a stick. Is it the simulation's fault? Is it yours? And I think maybe we'd kind of lose a sense of personal identity because, like, we don't really know who's controlling us and why everything's happening.
yeah, that's
And
right.
I feel,
Yeah, that's cool. Oh, go on. I'm sorry.
oh yeah, I was just gonna add, I mean, I think we'd lose our sense of like purpose and we'd kind of give up because, I mean, since it's all a simulation, like, is there a point really?
Yeah, so that's interesting because you seem to, in your reflection there, bring into relief the connection between a sense of self on the individual level or personal identity and one's place in reality, or the ground from which one encounters reality or even apprehends the real as real. So some philosophers who identify as realists, and that's a metaphysical position that we'll talk about during week 7 in great detail. It's also one of the important philosophical vocabulary words that you might reference if you need some further clarity in terms of definitions. But realists, just to keep it very simple, there are many varieties of metaphysical realism, but realism is the view that there is a mind-independent reality. And some realists, and there's a contemporary Italian realist who's a part of this philosophical school that's known as New Realism, Maurizio Ferraris. He argues that one important dimension of the real as such is its unamendability. There's something about reality such that we can't just manipulate it or alter it to our specified preferences or desires. And so certain sci-fi vehicles explore these themes, such as the episode San Junipero from Black Mirror, where one of the characters at one point in the simulated kind of afterlife angrily punches a mirror, and then a moment later it just fixes itself. And so that's an indication that you're not in the real, because there's some sort of intelligence behind preventing fractures in the design, right? Or mechanisms are in place such that those fractures are resolved or um, uh, yeah, I guess just resolved or repaired. So yeah, that's interesting. And so that would affect one's sense of self, one's sense of identity. Uh, so Karina, you have your little yellow hand up. Did you want to jump in here?
Yeah. What I'm hearing in this group's discussion is like a sense of sort of intrinsic purpose, and like there was like the talk of everything happens for a reason, and if we're in a simulation and all of these events are being created by some outside force, is there any meaning in that? I would argue that, like, is there like any reason to believe that there is a inherent meaning or an inherent goal, or that everything happens for a reason anyway? Because like everything happens because of something and leads to something else, but that's just basic cause and effect rather than being something that is like an extrinsic force acting on the world. I don't know if I worded that well, but I'm just kind of interested in this idea that that being in a simulation would mess with meaning, when it's like, well, do we have evidence for meaning anyway?
Yeah, so the hesitation or the maybe not hesitation, but the sense of of anxiety or perhaps even despair in the face of a prospect like existing within a simulation, um, is such that there would be meaning, but that meaning is inscrutable. And so it could be deployed for nefarious or not so noble or good ethical purposes on the part of some hidden intelligence. But leaving aside scientifically the hypothesis of existing within a simulation, we might turn to theology and religion and say, well, if there is some sort of, as Karina was suggesting, inherent meaning in reality, that could be traced back to the divine will or the divine mind. And with that, similarly, as some, for example, existentialist philosophers from the 20th century would argue, if that's the case, if there is a God who supplies inherent meaning for all of us and for the world or reality as we know it, and perhaps know it imperfectly, as our finitude makes certain, is there meaning there, right? So Camus, the French philosopher Albert Camus, and during this weird pandemic situation, I can't recommend his novel The Plague enough if you're interested in some light reading. But Camus argues in The Myth of Sisyphus, one of his most famous philosophical, so non-fictional works, that if the universe has no inherent meaning, then far from concluding from that it's totally insignificant, our existence, and we should be in despair, and it would be better not to live at all. He argues that existence would be all the better given a lack of intrinsic meaning in the universe, because then the human being is free, even in a condition, an essential condition of absurdity, which he recognizes. So if there is no meaning to anything, then reality is fundamentally absurd. But in an absurd world, we can supply and pursue our own meaning, our own values. But would that be, that sort of existential idea, would that be undermined or put into suspense, at least, if it turns out that we are living in a reality? And would that be similar to the conclusion if we were to discover somehow objectively that there is a God? What do you guys think about that? Yeah, go ahead, Renee.
Well, if we did live in a simulation, and you just mentioned all that religious stuff, my mind went to, wouldn't people immediately connect the simulation to God did this? Because looking at like being created in at least Christian religion, wouldn't we all be God's simulation? Because if God made everyone and then just like sent them out to do whatever, but also has a big purpose, wouldn't that make specifically that religion true? Or at least people would assume that it's true just based on, oh, there's some kind of creator with a higher purpose, and not seeing it as a simulation, but rather seeing the simulation part of it as, oh, that's just, like God's purpose. That that it would be very, very, I would think, affirming for religious people if we did turn out to live in a simulation, because I think they would go, oh yes, that's God. I mean that with no disrespect to anyone. I would think that would be pretty much confirmation that exists, if there was definitive proof that we were a simulation.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if we were in a simulation, that suggests that what we understand to be reality, the very milieu in which we carry out our lives and make decisions and have experiences and so forth, if that whole context or contexture as a whole were a simulation, then that means it's a kind of artificial representation of a reality that prior exists as the fundamental metaphysical baseline. That's exactly what simulation would entail. But if we transfer our focus here to the religious question or side of things, if God created the universe and imposed divine law on it, which gets translated into natural law and so forth, is that the same thing? Because if we understand that, maybe along metaphorical or analogical lines, is also describable in terms of a simulation, then that would suggest that beyond the world that we know as the product of God's will and decision, there's some other world. And is that the case, or would that be like heaven or something? So would our mortal life on earth be a simulated version of what goes on fundamentally in heaven? Or what do you think? Because I think the trepidation or the anxiety or the concern that we might feel if, I mean, whether we know it's true or not, it's an open question, that reality is simulated. Decoupling this from the religious or theological angle, I think that anxiety issues from the notion that there might be actors involved, intelligences involved behind the production of the simulation that are less than divine and thus less than beneficent. They could be, as I mentioned earlier, nefarious, whereas as Descartes argues, especially in the third and fifth meditation, which we're not reading, but the suggestion is throughout all the meditations, so we should already be familiar with it. And also from the comic, right, is that God is by definition essentially good. And that's what motivates Descartes' decision in the first meditation to replace God with some supremely powerful and deceitful evil genius or demon, right, rather than suggesting that God would ever want to deceive or trick us. So yeah, Karina, you have your hand up again. Did you want to add to that or say something?
Yeah, I think that the other thing is that, you know, if we are in a simulation, who are we to say that this is the first simulation? We can be thousands of simulations deep, and it's the same effect either way. Like, is it heaven? Or is it just another simulation beyond that?
Good. So the simulation hypothesis, as I mentioned, presupposes that there is reality that is artificially simulated. So in any case, there has to be some baseline reality. If we understand the simulation hypothesis in the terms Karina laid out as possibly opening up conceptually to a sort of Russian nesting dolls, like we're in one simulation as a layer, which is a simulation within a deeper simulation, and maybe that could be within a deeper simulation, and so on. But to avoid an infinite regress, because there has to be some baseline that is simulated, there would have to be some bottom to it, right? There would have to be some reality, even if it's inaccessible for us, poor finite human minds, right? Does that make sense? And so, yeah, who knows where the end of the simulation is? It could be like that film, what am I thinking of? With Leonardo DiCaprio, where there's dreams within Inception, right? Dreams within dreams within dreams and so forth. And the problem is, from the first person subjective point of view, we are incapable of recognizing in what layer we happen to be carrying out our lives. So in what layer of the overarching simulated structure we happen to be engaging with and relating to various simulated or artificial situations and objects and so forth. And so that's really the Cartesian aspect of all of this. Going back to the evil genius thought experiment, we could never really know whether we are within it, because that would require a kind of objective knowledge such that we would be standing above the simulation and the reality in an important sense, to be able to compare them in the first place. And this is a problem that we'll turn to and we'll spend quite a bit of time with in week 7 when we're in the second unit of the course. So maybe somebody from room 2, do you guys have any insights from that conversation, your breakout rooms?
Hello. We also discussed a lot of like similar things. We talked a lot about like number 3 and how like it would just create a lot of frustration and whatnot if you couldn't know what was real and what wasn't real. Just kind of talked about the matrix pretty much. How do you know if you're real if you can't know that you're real? Like, how do you know we're not in a simulation right now?
Right. And then, I mean, that opens up the question, and this is a part of that prompt. If we can't know, and so if it's just a vague suspicion, however much anxiety or discomfort it might bring about, does it ultimately matter? So, I mean, we still have the lives that we have, you know, whether they're real or not. We still have the desires that we have, the fears that we have, the relationships in which we come to recognize ourselves and others, and think what is most important to us, make decisions, and so forth. None of that would really be altered. In short, the very first person subjective grounding and orientation to the world, by which we say, I am, I exist, I think. So that's Descartes' fundamental insight in all of this. So would it really matter? So that's an important part of the question. So thanks for sharing that. But what about, I thought Shannon, you're one of the presenters, so you don't have to talk too much now because you're going to be contributing in just a few minutes. But how about room 3? Maybe Jody or Shay want to share something, since Nancy's going to present shortly.
It's okay. I want to talk about a different, well, like the Descartes ones.
Okay.
I think, okay. I think that he is certain that he exists because of all the things that, like, well, he like knows where he is and the surroundings around him. So like he knows how his body looks and whatnot. And not just that, like he asks himself questions of like that only he would know the answers to, because like he's the only one living through his life. Like even though he has a lot of doubt, it's still him.
Yeah, so even though he has a lot of doubt, he still exists. And the even though is important here because the doubting, even though the object of the doubt, the focus, the target of the doubt is his own being, his own presence in the world, that is, in a really perhaps counterintuitive sense, precisely what demonstrates. And demonstration has a peculiar metaphysical definition to it within philosophical discourse. It has the sense of something, in terms of logical argumentation, hard and locked, rock solid, right? So if you demonstrate something, it's like what a mathematician or a geometer does. So that captures the force of the cogito argument, such that if you're in a position to doubt at all, which is, as Descartes points out in the second meditation, a variety or species or example of thinking. So to doubt is just one form of thinking, and thinking presupposes or requires one who thinks, a thinker. Then your very doubt implies your existence in a demonstrative sense. That is, it can conclude for you objectively that you exist. And that seems fairly anemic or shallow, you might say, or simplistic at this point. So Descartes can conclude, I exist. We can all conclude, following the meditator's methodological procedure, that we exist. Great. That doesn't seem all that significant. So Descartes builds on that to argue, furthermore, not only can we recognize that we exist, and every thought, in fact, performs that knowledge implicitly, if not explicitly, we can further build on that and recognize what or who we are in our existence. So insofar as we come to know that we exist through thought, intellection, mind, we can then on that basis come to recognize our fundamental selves, our most essential selves, the I, the subject, as mind and not body, right? So that's Descartes' dualism, as it's called. And it's a metaphysical dualism, such that in terms of what exists, in terms of what is real, there are two orders. There is mind, you might say, and body. And by mind, we can mean soul, spirit, consciousness, thought, and so forth. And by body, we can mean physicality, materiality, and all the various attributes and qualities and properties that go along with those two orders of being. Okay. So yeah, room 4, maybe Renee Lockreed, did you have anything to add since we heard from Renee Croft and Karina?
No, I don't know what to add. It brought up so many questions for me, because a lot of what I was hearing is that regardless of physical stance or reality or non-reality, that we were talking about that believing in existing, of experience, whether it's real or not, whether it's physical or non-physical. But that brought up a question for me, is that if it's simulated, which means it's not real, how can you know that then who you are is real? And that brought up another thing, that if you are real, if you do believe that this is a simulation and your body or your surroundings don't classify who you are, how do you know that, I guess, that you exist? And where's the, like, it made me think of like the scientific aspect of it. If we are to scientifically prove that this is reality or non-reality, and that you can exist beyond what it is, how do you know? Like, it just brought up thousands of questions.
Good. So by these arguments, we can conclude whether reality, paradoxically as it sounds, whether reality is real or not. We can conclude with absolute indubitable certainty, which for Descartes is all that can legitimately qualify as knowledge. We can know that we exist. But what exactly does that mean, as Renee is asking here? In what sense do we exist? Because through the first meditation, Descartes already rejects his body as the object of such an existence, that is, as the reality undergirding and making possible such an existence that he recognizes through the skeptical doubt. So it's not body that exists. In fact, there might not be any body at all, as Descartes concludes from the first meditation. And then in the second meditation, he comes to the strong conclusion of his own existence. But what is that? And it might not be, even still, leaving the body to one side, the very thematic objects that come to populate our consciousness, so the things that we think about independently of the body. If reality as we know it is false, is a simulation, then we can't even really trust the veracity, the truth, that is, of the objects of our thought, the content of our thought. So if we can't trust the content of our thought, and we can't trust that there are bodies at all, whether ours or any bodies, not just human bodies or animal bodies, but this table that sits before me, the trees I see in the yard. So if we can't trust that any of that exists, or that the content of our thinking exists in the way that we think it, then what can we trust, according to Descartes' argument?
Exactly, that's what I was coming to, is that if we truly believe that none of this around us exists, how do we know that we exist, regardless of? So
according to Descartes, we can know we exist, because even if you doubt it, that just proves that you exist. So that's the first issue. And then the second one is, okay, knowing that I exist, and at this point, and this connects to the first prompt, I can't know that any of you exist, right? So I know I exist, but it could be that none of you are real. And the suspicion that I might entertain that none of you are real is perhaps even more forceful given this weird Zoom situation, right? And you could say the same about me. So I can't conclude, just given the material we have to work with from the first two meditations, I can't conclude that any of you exist. I'm certain that I exist, but I can't conclude that any of you exist. And as Karina just put in the chat, that view is understood as, or defined as solipsism, right? So that is the solipsistic point of view. And that's one of the vocabulary terms that's in that sheet that I provided you. So solipsism is the idea that only and each instance of subjectivity or selfhood, the only thing that can be known with any degree of certainty as true is the existence of one's own self. So I can't know that any of you exist. So I know that I exist. And I know as much from the material we have to work with from the first two meditations. The second meditation in particular, I can conclude that I exist. I couldn't do that yet at the end of the first meditation. Remember, at the end of the first meditation, I don't know anything. At the end of the second, I know I exist, but I can't know anything else exists. So then the question is, what is the I that I know exists? Given that I've already eliminated as a possible answer to that question, my body. So when I affirm my own existence, I'm not including in that affirmation my own body. And I'm also not including any particular content of my thinking. That is to say, I might right now think of an elephant, but I can't trust, even given that thought, that elephants exist. So I can't trust that my body exists. I can't trust that there are elephants, even if I think of them. So then what can I know that I exist from Descartes? And we don't have to answer this. I mean, perhaps the presenters will have some sense of how to answer this, but so that's just something to think about, and that's where we'll go with. So I think we should take just a quick break, a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and the presenters can lead us on a discussion. And then if we, given the remaining time, we'll jump back into the slides to clarify some of the important arguments from Descartes in the second meditation. Okay, so does that sound good? Any questions before we go on a quick break? All right, so let's meet back here at 11:32 or so, and then we'll give Shannon and Nancy the opportunity to lead us on a discussion. All right, so I'll see you guys in a few minutes. Cool. Okay, so Nancy and Shannon, are you guys ready to go? Cool. Are you going to use any media or anything like that I need to share my host status for? Okay. All right, so yeah, go ahead.
I can start. I was going to talk about the floating man one and how that relates to Descartes. And so from like Descartes' readings, what I got from that is he is big on the mind and not so big on the body. So he's heavily, and uses this example of like, if you stripped yourself down and you like had no body, no bones, no blood, some graphic thing, then how would you know who you are? And basically, as we discussed before, it's that ability to doubt, that ability to think, and to like doubt what's real, or to like try to figure out what's real is proof in itself that like at least you yourself exist, but that the body is not necessary for that understanding of existence. And that's the same in the floating man, starts pretty much the exact same way. Like if there was a man and his limbs weren't attached to him, or he didn't have knowledge of his limbs, then he would still have knowledge of himself. And so both of those just kind of reiterated the idea that like, do you really need a body in order to be yourself? Or the self more so, does it come from your soul or your consciousness as opposed to your body? And so I thought that was interesting, the kind of separation of the mind and body. And so like pose the question, like, do you even need a body? Is like your body just like a tool for your mind to like use to get around in the world?
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead. Do you guys? So, what do you think of that floating man thought experiment, though? And we'll talk more about it next week a little bit. And there's an existential comic for next week that's connected to the Hume reading. And so it's Hume talking with Avicenna. I mean, they didn't exist at the same time, obviously, but it's interesting because coming from the same starting point, both philosophers, Avicenna and Hume, they arrive at entirely different conclusions from the same starting point. But yeah, do you think that Avicenna is right in his conclusion, or what do you think?
I don't don't know. I see his conclusion and how you can be like, if you didn't know what your like body was, you would still exist if you have the ability to like think and understand your body. But I think scientifically, I don't agree, because you kind of need your body in order to like think, like not all of your body, but like in order to like have these thoughts and whatnot, you have to have an association of ideas, and the best way to have that is through relating it through yourself.
Yeah, so I mean, does everyone understand just the experimental setup of this thought experiment in itself? So the image, like what's going on with this flying man or floating man. So imagine, I mean, similar to Descartes, we're supposed to put ourselves in this sort of position. So imagine you are just sort of poof, miraculated into existence as a fully formed human being. And in that existence, you find yourself in a void. So you're just sort of floating in black space, and you're unable to perceive anything bodily. So you can't see with your own eyes that you have hands or legs or a chest or anything like that. You can't feel yourself. So let's say you're completely bound. There's no object around your body to give you any kind of sensation. So there's nothing that you can feel through the tactile sense, nothing you can perceive. It's just darkness. Nothing that you can perceive visually. There's nothing you can smell, taste, hear. Avicenna concludes that you would not know nothing, you would know something, and that something it's precisely as liminal as this might seem, your very existence. So what do you guys think about that? You think that that's right or not? Would you know that you exist? I mean, it's a pretty bizarre scenario to consider, obviously. Yeah, go ahead, Renee.
Well, it's along the same lines of what my group was talking about with the earlier question, when we were answering 3, and it's that you probably would know you exist if you have a consciousness, just no body. I mean, you wouldn't have something to base your existence off of, but the fact that you're thinking, like Descartes says, doesn't that mean that you exist? Even if there is absolutely nothing, you are nothing, but you still know that you're nothing. You can still perceive that you are nothing. So it would just be the experience of being nothing. So I think it's probably correct that you would know that you exist, even if you're not anything.
Well, if you perceive that you're nothing, I mean, isn't that paradoxical?
Maybe, but
Perceive, there has to be existence, and if there's existence, then there's not nothing.
I mean, at least physically, like visually nothing. Like you probably don't have eyes to see or something to feel. So if you are a consciousness, then you would understand that there's at least nothing like a body there. I just think that whatever you think could be, I don't know.
Okay.
And see, that's when I brought up the question, is just because you think, does that make it you existing? I mean, even an alternate existence, how do you know that your subconscious is your own? And that's where I came in and started asking questions there.
So your subconscious, how do you know your subconscious is your own? Yeah, so we haven't really considered subconsciousness in all of this. We've been talking about consciousness, which is always more or less reflective and explicit. That is to say, consciousness at the level of our discourse is at the same time self-consciousness. But even as self-consciousness, so using Locke's idea of a person, so when I'm conscious of something at the same time that I'm conscious of this computer in front of me, I'm also self-aware. So I'm conscious that there is a me in front of which the computer is positioned. But in all of these examples, so in the examples of subject-object relation, there is in fact an object right? And so this gives us a fundamental phenomenological principle. So phenomenology is the study of the experience of appearances. And in some measure, it's essentially the study of consciousness. And so this is a mode of philosophy that began in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But the fundamental phenomenological principle is consciousness is always consciousness of something. And so to be conscious means to be conscious of something. And the floating man doesn't seem to be conscious of anything. But according to Avicenna, there would be in any case a consciousness of self. But as René Lockery is asking, what is that self? Because there's no body and there can't be any ideas if this individual, the floating man, was just popped into reality, and that reality is just a void in which he is eternally falling. There would be no experiences to reflect on or to remember, to recall. So what exactly would he be conscious of? So this is a strange thought, because on the one hand, it seems obviously true that given no external sensory stimulation, we would still be aware of something. But then on the other hand, it remains mysterious what that something is that we could possibly be conscious of or aware of. So yeah, that's a good question, René. And then if you add into this the Freudian concept of a subconscious or an id, well, then it becomes even more complicated, right? But again, even the existence of a subconscious requires past experiences in which there are repressed, or in any case, temporarily suspended or forgotten memories. But those memories, however suspended or forgotten they are, have to be memories of something. But there doesn't seem to be any something that one could remember in this case, right? So does that make sense? Okay, did you have more to add, Shannon, or?
I guess I would say in that you would be conscious of your like existence only, and because like even though there's nothing, the perception of nothing is still a perception. And so I guess your existence would be based entirely on the memories of nothing, experiencing nothing.
Yeah, and then we have to ask, well, what is nothing? So if we say, I'm conscious of what? Nothing. Well, haven't we then turned nothing into a something?
Yeah. I don't think there can truly be like nothingness.
Yeah, that's a paradox. And it goes all the way back to before Socrates, to the very beginning of this intellectual tradition with the pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides, who argued there are two paths that one can take in constructing or arriving at truth and knowledge. There is the path, and this is Parmenides being spoken to by the goddess Truth, the goddess Aletheia. The goddess Truth or Aletheia lays out two paths. There's the path of being and the path of non-being. And then she says, but there is no path of non-being. Because the moment you traverse that path, you are turning nothing into something. And so nothing is the absolute limit of thought, of intellect. So there is only being. And then he develops really what amounts to the first deductive argument in logic. So in the history of Western philosophy, and the conclusion of that argument is there is no time, there is no change, there is no death, there is no birth, there is no difference, there is simply one thing. And all of those other aspects are just illusory. They're not bearing out reality. So we don't need to go down too far that rabbit hole, but yeah, so these are really strange thoughts that we end up navigating around. But Nancy, so you want to jump in now and share some thoughts?
Of course. Okay. The one that I really wanted to talk about was the John Pollock.
Mhm.
I don't know. I was just like, okay. So first of all, it's like really interesting, and like the plot twist that I had at the end, I was really intrigued by that. It was really interesting to like read at the end when he said that he also had that same procedure done, but he couldn't remember, and he didn't know how he felt about that at the end. Like, if, to me, it seemed like he was unsure if his soul was still the same soul as it was 3 months ago from when he had that. So, like, I don't know if he still thinks that he's the same person, or like if he's aware of what had happened to him. I also feel like he hasn't talked about it with anyone, because like, what if it's all just like made up and they're just like lying to him? And yeah, I don't know. I wonder if you like ever tell Harry what he saw, if he like ever experienced the same thing that he did. But yeah, like,
Can
oh,
you
go ahead.
can you for just a minute or so just describe the story, just the plot for those
I'd love to.
who didn't get
Yes.
a chance to read it?
Okay, so it was about obviously a wife and a husband, and then this other person, his name is Mike, and the wife and the husband's name is Harry. I can't remember her name. Anyways, I guess they were drugged, and Harry was sent into Margot and her surgical team like operated on him, and they had like cautious of his brain, like of what he was doing. So he like thought that he was still going to go into work the next day, or like he was still living his regular life, when he wasn't. He was like controlled by some computers. And Margot, yeah, Margot told Mike about that, and like why she wanted to do it, apparently just to get some approval of something, or like to prove a point. But he was weirded out by that, and then she ended up telling Mike that, well, he was scared that he was gonna get that same surgical procedure, but he wasn't, because he already had that 3 months ago. So after she told him that, he was like skeptical of how he felt, so he was like unsure of who he was. Like, to my understanding, I feel like he was unsure of who he was, and I feel like he just like wanted more answering, but he like couldn't go to anyone, or since he doesn't remember experiencing this, he's lost, I guess.
Well, even if he could pull out some memories of these scenes, would those memories even be reliable, given that what he understands as baseline reality, if what he's told is true, is correct, that's not reliable. So the memories would all be of a reality which isn't real. So that exaggerates or worsens the character's skepticism and anxiety about that, right? And so then when he confronts Margot and the other doctors and sees Harry on the operating table, if what he's told is true, then all of that isn't real. That's a simulation. So what he's experiencing at that moment is a simulation, right?
Oh. I don't know. I was really weirded out. Like, I started to think, like, oh my gosh, like, what if that happened to one of us? Like, what if, like, what we're doing right now is not actually what we're supposed to, like, what is happening to us, and we're, like, under the table or something? I don't know. I was really weirded out by that.
Yeah, so it turns out if Margot is being and what Mike now understands is accurate, then he is not Mike. He is not experiencing the world as he takes himself from a subjective first-person point of view to be experiencing it. Instead, he is a disembodied brain in some vat of nutrient that is some nutrient-rich liquid. And so the brain is connected to a sophisticated computer apparatus such that all of the content of his lived experience is really just a simulated event. And so the synapses and the neurochemical physiology of his central nervous system is simply being stimulated by a kind of series of algorithms. So any thought that he has about reality as he was familiar with it before could be false. Even memories that he has perhaps from early on as a child, right? Maybe those are being simulated. So now Mike is in a state of unrelenting, absolute skepticism, right? He can't recognize anything as true in a secure sense. But if Descartes is correct, if we follow Descartes after the first meditation, so taking up the argument from the second meditation, can Mike, despite that skepticism and radical doubt, can he know anything is true? So Nancy, you were suggesting that maybe he doesn't know himself and he wonders who he is, but can he know something at least? And you don't have to answer that, others can answer it too. But does anyone else have a thought about that? And this is, by the way, the question of the first reflection paper, which is due this week. So that's just to remind you again, or maybe for the first time, I'm not sure if I reminded you on Tuesday, that there is, so there are 2 reflection papers assigned for the whole course, and the first one's due this Sunday, and it has to do with relating the Descartes reading to the Pollock reading. And that's really the question. Does anyone have thoughts about that?
The other reading was the one about how we like define identity, right? The Pollock one.
Oh, that was the brain in a vacuum.
Okay.
Yeah, so the brain in a vacuum story, we were just talking about it, right? Mike gets a call from Harry's wife who says that he disappeared. And it's like some weird action movie scenario where Mike like is a commando or something. He scales the wall and breaks into this secret laboratory, having traced his friend there, and he sees his friend Harry on the operating table with his brain removed, sitting in a vat of liquid. And at that moment, Mike is found out, he's discovered, and he's told that the very same, because he's worried they're going to do that to him, and he's told that he doesn't have to worry because that very same procedure that he's currently witnessing was done to him 3 weeks ago, or maybe 3 months ago. Can't remember which. Right? So he had his brain removed, and everything he takes to be real, everything that he's experiencing is really just simulation, right? So he can't trust anything. And they let him go, right? So he leaves the building and he's free to live his life, whatever life that might be. But he's always plagued now by the suspicion that the content of experiences, of his experiences, the very objects of his thought are not real, they're not trustworthy. But then the question is anything to any degree from Mike trustworthy? And I think Descartes offers some answers there. So what do you guys think?
I think in the reading he brings up, or that the only thing that they can be like that we can be certain of that exists is our thoughts, and generally like what we're thinking, and none of our internal thoughts can be deceived by evil. So that's how like we can, I don't know if that makes any sense.
Good,
like,
yeah,
we
good.
know our existence.
Existence, right? So that's really the crux of the answer. Mike can know that he exists. Why? Because just like Descartes' meditator does in the first meditation, he subjects everything he thinks is true or real to this unrelenting doubt, right? He doubts everything, even what he takes for granted as immediately obvious, right? So he doubt anything. This is the procedure. Anything that can be doubted, even a little bit, Descartes commits himself to doubting absolutely, right? So anything that can be even to the slightest degree suspicious, Descartes' meditator submits that to this radical skepticism. So even the existence of his own body, even the existence of the physical world, yet he can still conclude, given that starting point, the meditator, Descartes' meditator, he can still conclude, and we find this in the second meditation, that he exists. Right? So now looking at the Pollock story, Mike is just like the meditator in the first meditation. He doubts everything, that he even has a body, that any of his earliest memories are true, that what he's presently experiencing is true. Yet, if Descartes is correct, he can at least conclude on the basis of that skepticism, of the activity of doubt itself, that he exists, that Mike exists, right? Now then, the question is still open as to what exactly the substance of that existence is. So Mike exists just like Descartes' meditator exists. And we, following this procedure, can also, for our own case, conclude that we exist. That is, from the subjective first-person point of view. But beyond that, at this point, we can't really conclude the truth of anything. So Mike can conclude strongly with absolute certitude that he exists. But then the question is, what is the nature of that existence? And he cannot doubt that he exists, but he can doubt the content of his thoughts just as much as he can doubt the content of his experience, right? Because it could be that our experience really is just purely mental. So the illusion that we're all thrust into, if we are existing in a simulation, could be such that there is no physical space at all, there are only our thoughts. And then the content of those thoughts, which seem to bear out relations between ourselves and the world, that could all be false too, right? So Malika suggested correctly, right? She's putting us in the right direction, that what we can trust is something about our thinking, but it's not yet the explicit thoughts themselves. So right now I could be thinking that I'm hungry for lunch and I'm going to eat a sandwich. But given that those thoughts point to existence outside of my own consciousness, I can't even come to the strong conclusion or weak conclusion that there are sandwiches in the world. So I can't trust that thought, right? But following Descartes' procedure in the second meditation, we're given a method by which we can come to trust the nature of our thinking. But this is a bit subtle at this point. And so we can continue. Do you have other thoughts that you wanted to share, or that you had ideas about, Nancy? But we can kind of build on this. We have some open questions here to deal with, but I want to give you some more time if you need it to, or if you wanted to say some more.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Like over, yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's, I'm going to open up the slides that I was working with last time, and I want us to walk more carefully and more slowly through the logical argument that Descartes gives us. And that will allow us to more clearly understand what's possible epistemically, that is, in terms of what we can know with any reliability. And that will also at the same time give us some insight from the Cartesian point of view in terms of the nature of reality. So this kind of metaphysical insight. And a part of that reality, obviously, would be ourselves. That is to say, the very nature of subjectivity, what it means to exist as a subject. Okay. So going back to this slide, just real quickly. Oops, here we go. So remember these two propositions or statements, these two sentences. I doubt that my body exists versus I doubt that I exist. So the first sentence is easily doubted. And again, we don't need to commit ourselves to the strong conclusion that the direction of this doubt is actually legitimate or true. Remember, Descartes' method is to submit to this radical doubt anything that can be doubted, even to the slightest degree. So insofar as we can doubt our bodies at all, we can doubt that our bodies exist, but the I there is untouched. So whether or not I do doubt that my body exists, and for my part, I don't doubt that my body exists. So I'll just lay that out there. The thing is, I can doubt it. It's possible. But in the second sentence, if I say, I doubt that I exist, I'm at the same time affirming that I exist. So that means, if we follow Descartes to his conclusion, that means that the I that remains untouched through this method of radical skepticism is necessarily not identical to my body, because the body did not survive that radical skepticism. I can doubt my body and the I remains untouched, but I cannot doubt the I itself, my being itself, without contradiction. Therefore, Descartes concludes strong metaphysical dualism, that the self is not identical to the body. And so here's where we get cogito ergo sum. Okay. So remember the ball of wax thought experiment from the second meditation. This is really important. So now really what we're going to do is, so it's already clear. I think it should be clear. And if you have questions about this, if it's still confusing, let me know. But it should be fairly clear at this point how we can conclude, following Descartes' procedure, that each of us as an individual, I, self, or subject exists. So now the question is, what is the self? What is the I? Descartes thinks we can come to that knowledge too, and further, we can come to that knowledge in a more satisfying degree than we can with respect to anything else. So the subtitle for the name of the second meditation is how the mind is more knowable than the body. So we are more immediately and deeply familiar with the nature of our minds, according to Descartes, than we are with our body. And if that's true, then you could express the thought in a different way by saying we are always already much more familiar with the nature of ourselves than we are with the nature of our bodies or any other bodies. And that entails or implies in the end that the I or self is not identical to the body. There is a difference, right? So here's the famous thought experiment from the second meditation. So Descartes invites us to follow this thinking, this experimental procedure. So he's at home sitting next to his fire in his pajamas, and he has a ball of wax. So at this point, the wax is perfectly smooth, perfectly round. It has a color, it has like a greenish color. The smoothness is a tactile quality, so you can feel it with your hands. Since it's so solid, if you were to knock on it with your knuckles, it would produce a sound, right? So there's the auditory quality, the sound quality. We have the visual quality in terms of the determinate shape, in terms of the color. It has a smell, so it still smells like honey or flowers rather. If you were to taste it, it would have a particular flavor or savor to it. So in short, according to all of our sense modalities, all 5 of our senses, the ball of wax shows up as the being that it is, bearing out a set of observable qualities, characteristics, or properties. Now the meditator takes that ball of wax, he brings it close to the fire, and it begins to melt. At this point, the shape has changed. It's no longer a perfect sphere. Tactily, it's no longer smooth. If you were to knock on it, it would produce no sound, given that it's now soft, and it would just get all gummy on your knuckles. The flavor, because now it's been a little bit burned, would be changed, as well as the scent, right? In short, all of the characteristics or qualities by which you are able to recognize the wax as a ball of wax have completely transformed, right? Yet, you are in any case able, without any difficulty, right? So it's not mysterious that we're able to do this. It's pretty simple and straightforward. you're able to recognize that despite all of these major changes in the ball, it's still the same substance, right? The ball of wax hasn't just been supernaturally or miraculously replaced with this other weird substance, right? So we say that one thing has changed, which means it's still the same thing it is, but the observable qualities or characteristics have changed. But how do we come to that conclusion? How do we recognize that the wax is the same given this complete transformation from point A to point B? Well, the meditator, Descartes, says it's not through the senses, because as we just pointed out, everything that is measurable or observable by means of the five senses has entirely changed. And it can't be through the imagination either, because this faculty is dependent on the senses, and we're leaving those aside. And also, you can't imagine very complex objects. So if I asked you to imagine like a die, like dice that you play with in certain games, a die with 1,000 sides, you would be incapable of conjuring up a clear mental image of that, right? So your imagination isn't really what does it for you. It is instead then, and this is again what we're after, is how you are able to recognize that even though the wax has changed in all these profound ways, it remains the wax. It's through reason, it's through intellect that we determine the identity of the wax despite these changes. And so thinking like a scientist, and Descartes was a scientist, thinking like a scientist. And so again, we shouldn't, especially in the 17th century, sharply differentiate scientists from philosophers, right? How would a scientist, not relying on their own subjective experience, how would a scientist come to conclude that the wax is the same? Well, by imposing a certain objective standard of measurement on it, like mass, for example. So even though the wax has melted, its mass will remain the same. And that wax, given that it's plastic, that is to say, not the material plastic, but that's an adjective, meaning that it can be formed and shaped in an infinite variety of presentations or figures. There is nevertheless, so you could turn the wax into a little horse or to a flower or to a little house or whatever, right? But nevertheless, throughout all those appearances, the fundamental reality of the wax perdures, or it endures. It remains self-same and consistent. And so it's not from our senses that we're able to come to that conclusion. It's instead through our reason or our intellect. Does that make sense to everyone? Are there any questions about them? So if we accept where Descartes is taking us so far, can we say anything now about who we are, about what the self is? Anyone have ideas? Well, I'm kind of already giving the answer away on this slide.
Is yourself your brain?
Well, not so fast on that. That's a sticky question that I think was unfortunately problematized by the John Perry reading last week, in which mind and brain seem to be identical, given that Gretchen Weyrob, if you recall, insisted that the self is the body and not the brain. Well, that's a bad conclusion, because the brain is, strictly speaking, body, right? The brain is a part of the body. So when Descartes says that mind and body are not identical, that mind and body are distinct, on the body side of things, he would include the brain. as an organ with undeniable importance when it comes to thinking in some manner, but it's not a strict identity for Descartes' purposes between mind and brain. And that'll become clear in a moment. But it is mind, right? Not brain. It is mind. And by mind, we mean precisely what I have in bold here: reason, rationality, intellect, entirely untied or disentangled from perception or any kind of sensory experience, which is grounded necessarily in the body and the body's sense organs, like our eyes, our ears, our nose, and so forth, right? So we can conclude then, following Descartes, that we are essentially, or first of all, that we exist. We can know that absolutely, and it's confirmed and affirmed every time we think anything, that we exist. And then furthermore, we can know the basic nature of that existence, that we exist in every moment as mind, as intellect, as pure thinking. And what are the functions of intellect or mind or pure thinking? Well, it's something comparable to what a computer does from Descartes' point of view. It's imposing these objective standards of measure, such as mass or weight or volume and so forth, which never for each case rely upon our senses. So I can't perceive visually or with my hands or anything else that's available from my body the mass of a ball of wax or of a chair or of an animal or anything else. So mass in the scientific sense of the word. I have to measure that, which is a procedure opened up and made possible by my intellect, my mind, my thinking. And because of that, however different our bodies might be and our experiences as grounded in our bodies of reality, however different those might be, we can all, as pure mind or intellect, come to a scientific consensus on the measurement of some entity in terms of mass, volume, weight, movement, and so forth. And so, and this is something that we'll talk about in week 7. So after the midterm, after we return to Plato, and then after we come back to Hume again for the second time. But this is something that was systematically codified for us, written down and presented in a certain argument by John Locke. But Locke was actually influenced by Descartes in his second meditation on this. So we'll talk about this distinction again in week 7. But how can we come to know the truth? That is, how can we arrive at certainty about the nature of the wax, even though the wax can change in an infinite variety of ways? How can we come to know what the wax is? Well, not through what Descartes would refer to and what Locke would explicitly refer to following Descartes, the secondary qualities. So the color, the sound, the smell, the texture, the taste. These are all given to change abruptly and in unexpected ways, right? So, and for example, how we each individually experience color is different. So I might see the shade of green before me a little bit differently than you see the shade of green, owing to differences in our sense organs, but also differences in the environment. So under certain lighting conditions or distance, colors appear differently. The same goes for sounds. And for those who have been sick, for example, you know that food tastes different when you're sick than it does normally. Or if you're outside in the cold and you come out and you pick up a hot cup of coffee, you'll actually, in a tactile sensory way, experience the heat differently than you would if you were in room temperature from the start, right? So all of these are secondary qualities, meaning that the experience of them is always caught up with, entangled with your subjective perceptual powers, right? So I'm sure everyone from many years ago at this point, but you might remember the controversy over the dress. So some people would see it as like, I think it was white and gold, and some people see it as like blue and black. and the same person might be able to see it in one or another of those color schemes at different times, but obviously not simultaneously. And that's because of various conditions make it impossible to unanimously bring together in a certain or unquestionable way the truth of our sensory experience grounded in secondary qualities. So then, to know what the wax is, you abstract away or ignore all of these secondary qualities, and you just focus on what Locke, following again Descartes, would label the primary qualities. And so those are what we would describe as objective. That is to say, they inhere within the physical object itself, independent of our thinking or consciousness. So in other words, the wax's mass, its weight, its volume, and so forth. These can be measured by a sort of independent standard, an objective standard, which would be the same for any subject, despite differences in our thinking or even in our bodily constitutions, right? Does that make sense? Oh, was I freezing up? Can everybody hear me now? Yeah, okay. So does this make sense? And so another aspect of the secondary qualities that makes them unreliable is that they are more so, in an absolute sense, more so than the primary qualities, caught up with our sense modalities or sense organs themselves. So our eyes, our ears, our nose, our skin, our gustatory sense of taste, whereas these primary qualities are not caught up in that way at all. Oh, Nancy can't hear me, but Renee, you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Uh-oh. So I guess Nancy's having some issue. Oops. Just typing her a message real quick. Okay, so I'm going to skip over some of this, and we have just a couple minutes left, and we'll come back to this at the beginning of class on Tuesday before we transition to Hume, and that'll make sense. It won't be terribly awkward because in many ways Hume is responding critically to Descartes, but this is to distill the essential deductive argument, logical argument from the second meditation down to premises and conclusion. So Descartes, so we have three premises and a conclusion. The first premise is my body has the property that I doubt it. Descartes as the meditator, or for all of us, whether or not we actually do doubt our bodies, we can doubt it, right? So let's say I doubt that my body exists. Well, then my body has the property that I can doubt it. And I can doubt it without resulting in a contradiction, right? Now, that doesn't mean that my body doesn't exist. It just means that I'm capable of doubting that it does exist without contradicting myself. But then in premise 2, my mind does not have the property that I doubt it. Because if I doubt that I exist as a mind, well, I'm simultaneously affirming and confirming, concluding ultimately that I do exist as a mind, giving that doubting is a species of thinking, and if there's thinking, there has to be a mind that's doing the thinking. And then this is a kind of principle that's implied, that's not an explicit part of Descartes' argument, but that he's drawing on to bridge the gap between the premises and the conclusion. That if two things are identical. So if we say, for example, that George Washington is identical with the first president of the United States, then they have to share all properties in common. And if they don't, then they're not identical. So from the first two premises, we can see that mind and body have separate, that is to say, different qualities or properties, which means they can't be the same. So Descartes concludes that mind and body are separate substances. And this is the basic rudiments for his substance or metaphysical dualism, that everything is bifurcated or hardly distinguished, separated into the categories of materiality and mentality, right? Or mind and body. Okay, so we're out of time and we'll leave it there, but I want you to consider over the weekend, and so we'll talk about this at the beginning of class next time before we get into Hume, if this is a good argument, and how, if you disagree with the conclusion, on what basis you would present that disagreement. So what would you say to Descartes presenting this argument to you? What flaws can you find in it? Okay, so I'll stop sharing there. But so thanks for the presentation today. Really good job. We had an excellent discussion. Really appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a good weekend. And I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See ya.